Welcome to the Borders in Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples in the Salish Sea region. As we know, human history has led to the construction of border systems between different political entities. Human groups have sought to differentiate themselves spatially by boundaries, delimitations, legal conventions, border guards. They have also formed alliances and buffer zones. As we also know, humans belong to the group of primates. And there are other types of borders that exist in the primate and non-human world. In fact, what is sometimes called the animal kingdom reveals many forms of non-human territoriality. This type of phenomenon is observed in mammals as well as in birds, insects, or fish. Today, we are going to talk about non-human borders with Ammie Kalan, assistant professor at the University of Victoria and field-based primatologist interested in wild great apes and what it can tell us about hominin evolution using a comparative perspective. Great to see you, Ammie. Welcome on board.
Thank you, Benjamin.
Human borders are instruments for managing relations between different contiguous political entities. They come from a phenomena of contact and encounter. The history of the border is included in the great history of the means of spatial and political differentiations of groups of humans. Some animals have the ability to mentally represent their territory. They memorize itineraries, places, trajectories. These territories are of several types: territory for food, for reproduction, for protection, for sleeping, and they merge for many species. But first of all, Ammie, let's start the interview by giving some information about your scientific specialty. What is the object of study of primatology, and what are great apes?
That's a good question. So, thanks for the question. I'm a primatologist, as you nicely said in the introduction, and primatology is really the study of primates. So you can consider it sort of a branch of biology where biologists kind of specialize in studying non-human primates, but is also a part of anthropology. And the reason why it's part of anthropology is because anthropology, which you consider is the study of humans, given that humans are a primate, anything that we can learn about non-human primates to sort of help us better understand the human condition is why primatology is actually historically and traditionally also part of anthropology.
Mm-hmm.
And then great apes is a special term that we use and is reserved for some of the largest primates in the world, which includes ourselves, the gorilla, which is the largest primate in the world. You probably may be familiar with like large silverback gorillas and knowing how large they can get, but also the chimpanzee and the chimpanzee's close sister species, the bonobo, as well as the only Asian great ape, which is the orangutan.
Thank you, Ammie, for these clarifications and definitions. We know that there can be a risk of anthropomorphism in studies of animal behavior. Studies and some scientific documentaries show us that communication between animals are rich and complex. Some authors believe that the language itself was born from the need to adapt to a new demand, the coordination of joint action. How do chimpanzees communicate with each other? Do the vegetation, the trees, play a role of a medium?
Yeah, so that's a good question. And indeed, all primate species, just like all other animals, use sort of species-specific signals that they have evolved over time to communicate with one another. And with primates specifically, we've observed that they have really rich vocal repertoires, so vocalizations, different types of calls that they make, as well as gestural repertoires. So this would include facial expressions, but also body movements and moving the hands and the arms to try and indicate a want or a need, or also an action or a desire that you want from another individual. So, for example, things like if you want to be groomed, you might put your hand up in a certain way or scratch your body. That's what sometimes chimpanzees do to indicate a desire to be groomed by another. So just as with other animals, and especially other kind of social animals, chimpanzees and other primates we see have a really rich sort of variety of signals that they can use to communicate with one another. When it comes to the second part of your question regarding the trees, that's an interesting question, specifically because chimpanzees interact with trees every day, all the time, mostly because that is their primary source of food. So from a feeding perspective, they're always interacting with trees. They also sleep in trees. They build nests in trees. So a lot of their life and daily activities are centered around the trees. That's why they need trees to survive. At the same time, they also do use them for communication. So one of the most common behaviors you might observe in wild chimpanzees is something called buttress drumming. And this is where chimps will use their hands and feet and sort of bang on the trunk or the big roots of a tree. And this is sometimes used to kind of communicate long distances with other chimpanzees, just for that exactly that purpose that you described, Benjamin, which is, to try and find others in your group, to coordinate, to meet up, to meet at a foraging place or a feeding tree, or to just find each other for a grooming session or to travel with one another.
Okay, great. Many thanks, Ammie. And of course, they have a great knowledge of their ecosystems. Humans like to compare themselves with animals, their strength, their intelligence. Research in ethology has shown that some animals can use tools and respond to complex problems. My question is this one. Do great wild apes, like chimpanzees, use tools? For example, stones or wooden sticks. I read somewhere that chimpanzees can throw rocks to impress rivals and maybe even mark a territory.
Yeah, so first part, definitely some non-human primates do use tools. And chimpanzees are remarkable in that regard, in that they use probably the most variable number and sorts of tools. So they are quite proficient at using stone tools in the wild, but also sticks, leaves, forms of vegetation to create things like, they could create sometimes sponges, like leaf sponges to take water out of a tree hole. They will use sticks to take out, to put sticks through a big hard termite nest to get the larvae of the termite to eat the termites, or to fish ants out of a nest. They will also use stones, very famously, for cracking nuts. There are some populations of wild chimpanzees that very regularly and often use stone tools of different sizes to crack open hard encased nuts. And they will also sometimes use wooden tools like strong wooden hammers to also do the same. And in a population that I've studied, we've also seen chimpanzees using stone tools by throwing them at trees. And so this might be the latter thing that you were referring to in your question. We've called this accumulative stone throwing. And it's different from what we observe, generally speaking, which is in other chimpanzees and kind of chimpanzees that you might encounter in the wild. They're quite happy to throw things. They like to throw stuff, especially during a male display where he wants to kind of throw heavy things around, make a big ruckus and show that he's very strong and capable. But the cumulative stone throwing behavior is different from this in that we observe chimpanzees, usually still adults, but they come to certain trees, and at those trees, they pick up rocks and throw them at those trees. And they do this repeatedly, and different individuals will come and do the same thing. And we find that in the landscape, this is only like a handful of trees that actually have this kind of behavior. And if you are walking in the field and you want to find these trees, it's very easy to see. because unlike most of the trees you will see around you, you will all of a sudden find a location that has a tree that has been battered with scars from being repeatedly hit with stones. And it is unavoidable to miss that. You can very clearly see it because the tree repeatedly heals its wounds over those scars. And you also then, of course, see rocks at the base of the tree, or sometimes even piled up into the hollow. And so this is actually a point of my research at the moment. I have a master's student that just finished looking at kind of and analyzing kind of the data, looking at where are these sites distributed. And so far, it looks like we're finding evidence that these sites are actually located in places that are significant to the chimpanzees in that they provide stable resources like food trees or nesting sites where they sleep. And we still have to look even further at trying to better understand the patterns of use of the chimpanzees in this landscape. So trying to see like where are they moving, and then how are those sites located in relation to that movement. And that's still to come.
Okay, great. Thank you for this answer. Now let's move on the topic of internal boundaries. Can we speak of political or social boundaries within the same group of chimpanzees?
Yeah, I really liked this question, I have to say. It made me think a little bit more deeper about how I understand, for example, chimpanzee society. And I'm not sure if you're going to be satisfied with this answer, but I'm going to give it a go. So I think that, yes, you can speak of political and social boundaries. Social is easier in that this is kind of what we, as an animal ethologist, it's very easy to think of a social boundary for animals because we usually use the social group as our unit, right? So a social group would be considered of like all the chimpanzees that affiliate with one another in a given territory. And that is the group or the community. We use this term specifically for chimpanzees. But then, of course, within that social boundary, you do have political boundaries in a sense. I'm not sure if boundaries is the right word. Maybe you're the better expert to tell me about that. But I thought of the fact that within a chimpanzee community or society, you do have different individuals, different personalities, and different friendships and alliances that occur. So you will very clearly see that some individuals, spend more time together, groom more together, share food together, are more likely to do certain activities together, while others will be maybe on the periphery or will be more likely to be found with other individuals. And in that sense, these kind of alliances and the changing and shifting coalitions that we see within a chimpanzee society do in some ways reflect what we see in kind of human societies as like political groups or political societies. At least from my kind of naive viewpoint of politics. So I'm not sure if you agree with that, but I do think that within chimpanzee society, we do have this complexity of, particularly when it comes to males, because males are sort of the male hierarchy is sort of the main thing the main social aspect that kind of regulates a chimpanzee society, although females are also important, but for additional reasons. We find then that among the males and this kind of navigating this male hierarchy, politics becomes integral and really important. And so the personalities of individual males and how they navigate and create friendships or forge new bonds and new alliances is very significant. And sometimes it can lead to them being more successful in getting higher rank, climbing up the ladder, so to speak. Or sometimes if they don't make the right alliances or they don't make the right decisions or they annoy people or other chimpanzees, they might actually go lower in the ladder. And in that sense, it is very much a political kind of atmosphere in this chimp society.
Yeah, very interesting to hear all of that, Ammie. It's therefore clear for me that these groups of chimpanzees form complex societies with truly visible forms of power. Many authors have drawn parallels and also differences between human territoriality and non-human territoriality. Experts on the field of ethology specify that certain non-human species are more or less territorial, according to their social organization or their preoccupation at the time. That some species are not territorial, like the snakes. Some other species, like the cats, have rather temporal territories, which they could defend it only during a given period. In the case of the Siberian tiger, this tiger has networks of territories over a long distance between which they can move. In the world of chimpanzees, are there spatial boundaries between distinct groups? Does it have territorial marks of one kind or another?
It's a very good question. So chimpanzees are highly territorial, which means that it does come with them not sharing their territory with other groups, and they actually defend those territories. But when it comes to actually delineating that territory, gets a bit fuzzy. So we can clearly always sort of see usually a core component to their territory, and then outside of that will be sort of the boundary area, or the area that might have sometimes other groups visiting periodically. So you could imagine, for example, there's a certain fruit trees in the boundary area of the territory, and at times you might find that other groups might come there. So this can be an area where there's maybe a little bit of overlap with another group's territory. And this is why then the chimpanzees actually themselves behave slightly differently. When they're in the periphery of the territory, they're much more vigilant, because if they were to encounter, like whether vocally or visually, observe and see and encounter these other groups, then that would result in usually a fight of some kind, and some kind of intergroup encounter is what we call it. And so what's interesting is that as a human observer, you often try to look to see, okay, if physically around me in the landscape, can I tell that I'm now in the periphery of the territory? For example, if you didn't already know the group's movements well. And it's hard to tell. There's not that there's like a clear, indication in the landscape that you have now reached the end of the territory. It is only from your observations and continued, usually we use, like, for example, GPS, and you can see the movement of the chimpanzees. So you know that they don't frequently come in this area as often as they do in their core area. And the thing that actually then therefore tells you usually that you're in the periphery of the territory, or at the boundary of the territory, is the chimpanzee's behavior, because that is what changes. And that tells you that, okay, here, this is a place where they are vigilant, they are careful, they're monitoring their surroundings much more. And that's usually because they're outside of the safety of their core area, and they need to be more alert. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you for this answer, Ammie. As you said, maybe territories of chimpanzees could be seen as a space, but this space is built by behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
It's the key element is behavior.
Yeah.
Scientific research has revealed that groups of chimpanzees can split into two. Why can groups of chimpanzees fragment?
Yeah, this is where those political boundaries can come into play, for example. So groups or communities of chimpanzees that get very large, for example. So there are communities that have gone up to 200 individuals, for example.
Wow.
You can imagine in there, if you have so many individuals, that means you have very many males and very much different personalities and different alliances and coalitions emerging. And in that kind of political atmosphere is where you can get sort of this intense competition with one another that can drive this fission of a group. Mostly because if you think about it, the males are all competing for access to females to create offspring, and access to the best feeding spots, the best food resources and sleeping spots. And so when you have such a large group and you have this intense competition that then arises, this is where you're likely to observe this kind of fission of where a group will then split into more than one group.
Okay, thanks, Ammie. Some authors have said that an animal does not defend a space, but it defends itself. As I said before, and you confirm that, territory is not a space, finally, it's more behavior. Your last answer brings me to the question of the relationships between different groups of chimpanzees. Are there territorial conflicts, wars between groups of chimpanzees for the control of a space or a territory and its resources? And why do chimpanzees not tolerate the presence of other groups?
Yeah, so we have this, there's something in the chimpanzee psyche that is very much a psychology that we would maybe refer to as sort of an in-group versus out-group psychology, meaning that they are highly territorial, and with that territoriality comes this desire to defend our group from others. And usually what we think as primatologists, that is motivated by having access to their territory. That space comes with access to stable resources, sleeping resources, food, and also space for supporting a certain size of a community, a size of a group. And so that is what they are defending when they are, in fact, encountering another group. Because if you were to not defend it as a chimpanzee, then that group would have free availability to come into your territory and take those resources. And so even though we've said that, you can't really see the territory, I mean that as a human observer, I cannot see it. But as a chimpanzee, it is very clear that they know where the start of their territory or the end of their territory is. As I said, they start to act differently. They behave differently, and that's what gives me the indication that I'm at the edge of their territory. So they do, in fact, have these territorial conflicts. They have these intergroup conflicts, and we've seen through long-term data that when they have these intergroup conflicts, losers and winners, that's a real consequence to that behavior. Anyone that wins an intergroup contest has the ability to perhaps enlarge their territory and then be able to support more individuals in their territory or be able to feed at preferred feed fruit sites or something like this. And so that's a real consequence to having your territory become smaller or larger. And so there is something worth fighting for in that sense. At least evolutionary speaking, we can see this and that makes sense to us. And then on top of it, there's that intergroup conflict, which is just that when other chimps see other chimpanzees that are not in their group, it is, or even hear them, if they even hear them vocalize, there is an immediate response to be hostile and to protect and defend your territory.
So they are very close to the human species, huh? that's not that's not a lie. We are all primates, huh?
Yes, that's. I can also add something though. There is something that helps us to sort of understand the nuances of the human condition, in the fact that although chimpanzees are highly territorial and as I've described, quite hostile to any other group members, the sister species of chimpanzees, the Panpaniscus, which is the bonobo. It's a little bit less well understood and less well studied because it only lives in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But there are now decades of studies now out on them. And from what we see in the bonobo is completely different to the chimpanzee, even though they're so highly related. So for example, bonobos will quite happily spend time with other bonobo groups. They will even feed with them, sleep with them. They have they're much less territorial. They don't have these kinds of hostile, immediate impression towards strangers or outgroup members. And on top of it, they also have a society that is it's much different than chimpanzees in that females can be co-dominant with males.
Wow.
And so there is something else entirely going on when it comes to bonobo societies and even bonobo politics, because the females have kind of a higher political voice as well in that sense. And so even though within the pan genus, you have chimpanzees and bonobos that are both equally as closely related to humans as we are to them, suggests that, when it comes to our evolutionary history and the way that humans are, we see also the good and the bad in humans, right? We see the we see the peaceful and the war in humans, and we can also see that traced into the pan genus.
Wow, amazing. Thank you for sharing that. One of the areas of research in primatology concerns the question of the origins of mutualist cooperation. And the groups of chimpanzees living in the wild provide proof of this existence of collective action, particularly in terms of borders and the edges of territories. Some authors have even spoken of border patrol. What is this phenomenon?
Yeah, this is a very interesting. I've been privileged enough to spend time with wild chimpanzees and to be able to see this myself. And I can tell you it is a highly conspicuous behavior. And this is what I actually was referring to when I said that as a human observer, when you are at the territory of a chimpanzee, at the periphery of a territory of a chimpanzee, because the chimpanzees start to act different. And what chimpanzees will actively do, and I should make a little disclaimer that this is quite common for forest living chimpanzees, but some chimpanzees that live in like bigger kind of savanna woodland landscapes, we have yet to really see clear evidence of border patrol. So this might represent kind of a different challenge to them. I can talk about that later if you want. But within a forest, what we see is that very clearly chimpanzees will all of a sudden sort of coordinate their behaviors. So you might see all of a sudden an alpha or a high-ranking male kind of go bipedal, stand up on two hind legs, look around, and then all of a sudden fall really silent, and then go back knuckle walking on all fours, very silently, deliberately, moving slowly, not making too much sound, scanning the landscape, the environment, as if listening and stopping to listen and looking around, being very vigilant and alert. And other chimpanzees, the adults, particularly adult males, will fall in line behind him.
Wow.
And almost as if they're forming somewhat of like a defense line of sorts, they walk kind of in unison, kind of synchronizing their movements, going very slowly. So if the one at the head of the line stops, then all like a dominoes, the others will all stop to also listen and look out. And why they're doing this is because they are being vigilant, because they want to hear or know if anyone else, any other groups are inside the territory there, so that they can then respond if they need to. And then so this is really that border patrol phenomenon, and sometimes it can take up to hours. And chimpanzees will also just do this periodically. So they don't necessarily have to be suspicious or hear something in the edge of their territory. They may just say, or decide that we want to go to a fruit tree, maybe like in the border patrol area, in the border area, or they may not decide anything and instead just patrol and then come back to the core of the territory. So it's really an activity that requires this kind of group coordination and commitment to be present, help with this kind of defense, because of course, when they do these kinds of border patrols, they're often more likely to meet a stranger group, right? And then that will result in a fight if they actually meet them. So, of course, it takes some bravado, it takes some strength and courage, and you have to also have trust in your compatriots, your other group members, that they will stay and fight with you and not run away.
Wow. Thank you for sharing all this data. I mean, it's very interesting. And do you think the first chimpanzee of the line is the alpha male or not?
No, not always.
Not always.
And you can think of this as can also be a great way. It's usually high-ranking males, but it's also a great way if one wants to think strategically and anthropomorphize, which I think which it's very difficult not to do when you are staring at chimpanzees in the wild. It's a great way to show that you are a potentially good alpha for the future.
Yeah, okay.
To build your reputation, your status in the group.
Yeah, of course. And could we see this border patrol phenomenon in the bonobo system?
As far as I know, no one has reported border patrols in bonobos. And that kind of goes in line with what we see with bonobos, that when they see other group members, they seem to just often actually celebrate and feed together.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, amazing difference.
Yeah.
The word border in international law means territorial delimitation, which comes from the word limit, which itself is borrowed from the Latin limes, which means path bordering a field, path between two fields, a limit, a border. I speak of this etymology thinking of the phenomenon of the border patrol phenomenon, the collective alignment of different chimpanzees of the same group form a kind of surveying of space. They co-produce a kind of common path where they can better hear, as you said, and observe what is happening in other territories, while they are also marking their own territories by this alignment. So how this phenomenon of border patrol is illustrative and explanatory of an organized collective action of chimpanzees. What are the characteristics of this collective action? You gave us some details, but could you expand a little bit more?
Yeah, I think so. I think in the sense that it is a collective action because it coordinates their behavior. It's coordinating the behavior of multiple individuals to actively help with the defense of the territory. And so like, as I mentioned, that they usually synchronize their movements, they synchronize, for example, if one individual smells something on the floor to try and sometimes detect a potential intruder, other individuals following behind will also go and pick up the same thing and smell it as well. So in this sense, like very much synchronizing and coordinating movements so that you are basically representing the group as a whole rather than, becoming these kind of separate individuals. And that, in a sense, is used to then also show the strength of the group in case there is an encounter with strangers. Another thing you said, which is like, you mentioned limes, and that this means actually a path between two fields. I was thinking that, what we do see when chimpanzees use a territory, they often do prefer certain paths and routes. And I think this is true of many different animals. But of course, when it comes to territorial animals, then you can imagine that although we are not sometimes that great at seeing it, I have been able to detect that there are certain places and paths sort of that become evident in the forest of the routes that they prefer to take. And those paths in themselves, I never thought about it this way, but in a sense can be used to indicate that this is, the end of our territory or something like this. So animal paths, just from the treading and use of an area, similar to what humans do, if they're using an area that you end up just creating a path by consequence of that use, is also, in a sense, what we also observe in chimpanzees and animals like this, that especially do this type of monitoring of their territory.
Amazing. Thank you, Ammie. I now have a more general question about the relationship between humans and non-humans in relation to our topic. What can the study of behavioral flexibility in wild great apes about hominin evolution tell us?
Oh, that's a lot. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a big question. So I guess, so one of the reasons why one of my big specialties, I guess, is behavioral flexibility. And I focus in on chimpanzees mostly because they show a lot of behavioral flexibility. And what I mean by that is that if you think of certain animal species, or the majority of animal species that you probably know, most individuals of that species are capable of doing sort of the same thing. And most groups that you are, animal groups you would encounter would have the same types of behaviors, same types of actions that they do. And you would not observe any kind of variation across different groups or different, across different groups, for example, or populations. And what we see, in fact, in like chimpanzees and also other primates, some other primates, is that we see this like intense ability to adapt and change their behaviors in response to their environmental challenges or even social challenges. And so why that's important from a human perspective and understanding human evolution is because of all the species that have ever existed, we are the best at being able to be flexible and to be able to change and adapt to external conditions. We have become so good at that we have made and actually changed those external conditions to better suit us. Mm-hmm. We use technology, shelters, clothing. We can make the world work for us.
Yeah.
Whereas animals are still usually at the mercy of the world around them. And chimpanzees are maybe somewhere kind of showing us the beginnings of that ability to show us how they can actually change or work with the environment to make it better adaptive for them. Things like, for example, the tool use we talked about, being able to use tools so that you can better extract resources from the environment that is presented to you or that you are in. Or, for example, if you have a very dry season or very drought where there's less water, being able to use things like sponges to take water out of tree holes if you are living in a dry environment. Or, for example, we have chimpanzees that live in such dry places that they actually will just go and sit in pools of water and relax and cool off that way. While generally speaking, other chimpanzees would be kind of terrified to go into water. Yeah. And to sit in water because they can't swim. So they generally have this hydrophobia of water. And this is what I mean by that, given like different kind of environmental constraints or challenges, we observe the same species. This is all the same species changing their behavior, adapting their behavior so that they can be better kind of suited and adapted to their environment that they're in.
Great, Ammie. Thank you very much for all your informations. We have come to the end of our discussion. I would like to speak a little bit about some authors speak about chimpanzees' cultures. Could we identify a culture? The term culture, is it appropriate to describe what is going on between chimpanzees? What do you think?
Yes, definitely. Basically, when I talked about sort of these different behaviors or that we might observe in different groups of chimpanzees, that is essentially a form of culture. Because what you're finding is that these are different ways of different groups or societies of the same species that they have found to live their lives. So they have, social customs in a way, and which is essentially what we mean when we talk about cultures in humans. Whether those social customs are how we eat or what we eat, or how we groom, or which types of gestures or vocalizations we make, or certain types of communicative actions, or other behaviors, or certain tool use behaviors. These are all types of ways in which chimpanzee cultures can be different across groups. And in fact, I think when it comes to non-human primates, chimpanzee cultures are perhaps the richest example of culture in the non-human domain. And so this is also one of the main reasons why myself and along with many other colleagues, we have been arguing that we need to actually protect some of this cultural diversity that we see in chimpanzees. Because as these populations are actually drastically threatened in the wild due to habitat destruction and mostly habitat destruction due to many reasons, often so forces that are more global than local, actually. And I mentioned already the need for chimpanzees to rely on trees. They need to have at least some trees in order to survive. This is where we are seeing that these low populations or decimation of populations in some areas is also coinciding with the loss of behavioral and cultural diversity. And if we as humans want to kind of protect our evolutionary kind of past, our evolutionary history, to maybe perhaps better understand where we come from and our origins, one of the things that we should think about very seriously is trying to then protect and preserve that cultural diversity that is present, and that is only present in the wild, in these natural populations of chimpanzees. We're basically trying to make the argument that this is another primary reason to try to get attention, conservation actions to focus on protecting many of these different populations of wild chimpanzees.
Thank you, Ammie. My last question is linked with what you just said. Last question, but not least. Unfortunately, as you said, we know that the habitats of great apes and many other animals are threatened with the extension of urban areas, cultivated or industrialized areas. How to better protect group of primates? You just spoke about conservation. Should human governments enforce a type of, a fence, of barrier, but a good one, between the human world and the non-human habitats in order to protect the populations and their landscape and their life?
Well, I can say that is actually the way that conservation was done back in the 70s. The people thought that was the only way to protect the non-human world, was to put a fence around it. But of course, we know now that is a terrible way to protect the natural world, and that in most cases it's not going to work, and it will result only in creating greater conflict and also unhealthy populations. When you think about animals, they don't have these fences in nature. They need to move. A healthy group of chimpanzees, for example, requires that females leave the group and disperse to go to other populations. That's how you keep a population healthy, viable genetically, as well as ensuring that you don't get these kind of things like inbreeding depression and stuff like that can happen if you have a fenced off population that can no longer move. Plus, of course, you have animals. The larger the animal, the more space it needs. It needs to be able to move. And then that becomes just not possible, or really to enforce such a fence-like boundary. On top of it, usually these types of protected areas, you can call them, require then a huge investment in law enforcement in order to actually even be useful. Because if you don't have a protected area that is actually enforced, then it's essentially not a useful protected area in general, because the boundaries or the fences can be easily, compromised. And so what we're finding nowadays is that we kind of have to grapple with the idea that, in fact, many of these places that we consider wild do already have humans in them, and have had humans in them for centuries. And so what is perhaps a better way forward, and what is, I think, the best way forward, is to, rather than enforcing, a non-human divide, rather trying to understand these kind of shared landscapes that humans and non-humans share, and to find ways in which we can help kind of actually local populations that are often usually also suffering in some of these areas where we see non-human primates, just given the geographical spread in the places, the tropics, and for example, where they're often found, and to find ways in which, we can find coexistence and peaceful sharing of landscapes, so that we can optimize human livelihoods, but also biodiversity, and including primate conservation. And I think this kind of compromise is really the only way forward.
Okay, thanks, Ammie. Thanks for this message of we humans needs to make more efforts Finally, even if we can think that humans have certain capacities specific to themselves, we can also reverse the observation. Some animals also have specific types of skills. For example, the fascinating and mysterious one of grasping the perception of the Earth's magnetic field, or the one using a system of acoustic orientations like echolocations for the bats. In short, it appears that humans still have to make great efforts to understand biodiversity on a planetary scale and the inextricable knot of all living species and the phenomenon of life in general. Thank you very much, Ammie Kalan, for participating in our podcast series. It was a very great discussion, very instructive about non-human borders and bordering phenomenon. Thank you very much for your participation, Ammie.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
This was the Borders in Globalization podcast. Thank you for your attention and see you soon for the next issue. Bye-bye.